The Bible Treasury. A monthly magazine of papers on scriptural subjects. Article 2 Part 86 of 95, Volume 15, 1884 and 1885. Scripture Imagery. J. C. Bailey. Forbidden Diet. The Swine, the Hare. It appears somewhat strange that Keshub Chunder Sen's religion of yoga has not been more successful than at present seems to be the case, for it has in it every element of popularity. The only way of accounting for its failure is in recognizing the truth of what Talleyrand cynically said to the founder of Theophilanthropy when the latter was bewailing the poor reception which the public were giving to his invention. It is very hard indeed to make a new religion popular. If one, however, could perpetually preach it, deny oneself all rest and comfort, be put to death and rise again to establish it, it might eventually succeed, but otherwise 'tis poor work. The fact is that people, with the exception of a few, like the harebrained Athenians, always looking for some new thing, and a few professional skeptics, who have generally credulity enough to believe almost anything, have we not lately seen a leading atheistic teacher become a believer in Madame Blavatsky's theosophic miracles? The fact is that the bulk of people are very reluctant to accept a new faith, otherwise Chunder Sen's yoga, see note, would have had a worldwide acceptance, for it fits human nature to perfection. It consists in selecting the fancy hits out of the other religious systems, rejecting the rest, and joining them neatly together, for all the world like a patchwork quilt, though perhaps hardly so useful. Note. This is something of the principle of Lewis Carroll's caucus race. The competitors started when they pleased, ran as far as they liked, left off when they felt disposed, and all took prizes. End of note. Now, these remarks apply to such passages as the 11th chapter of Leviticus, where certain prohibitions and restraints are announced to the Israelites as to diet and other matters. For we see around us those who take portions of the Jewish religion, who put themselves nominally under the Jewish law, keep the Jewish feasts, and ceremonials, and appropriate the Jewish promises, but do we ever see a single person abstaining from the meats forbidden to the Jews, or submitting to those restraints which are inconvenient? For instance, we ask, why do you follow the lines of worship ordained for the Jews, and appropriate the Jewish feasts, ceremonies, and promises? Because it is thus commanded in the Scriptures. Commanded to the Jews, yes. They are also commanded to offer animals in sacrifice, not to eat pork, nor to light fires on the Sabbath. Do you also obey these commands? No, all that is different. Ah, that is different. You think then that you are at liberty to take what you like and leave what you don't like. So did Chunder Senator Yoga? I am afraid that will not do. These directions respecting food were given to the Jews, firstly, in order to make a distinction between them and all other peoples, for at that period God had an object in secluding his own people that they might have a fair trial by being kept from mingling with other nations and their contaminations. Now, however, the people of God are sent out amongst the peoples of the world to disseminate their principles and are to be distinguished not by outward actions or garb, but by what is inward and spiritual. Therefore what was physical with the Jews becomes typical to the Christians. Now there is perhaps nothing that has so much effect for good or bad on human beings as what they consume for the nourishment of the body, and appropriate for the nourishment of the soul. A foul-eating people will be in most ways physically foul, and a foul-thinking man will be in most ways spiritually unclean. Consequently, all that the Jews took into the body by eating, must be cleanly, and all that the Christian takes into the soul should be pure. Some think it strange that the Hebrews' God should concern himself about the details of their diet. It would be still stranger if he did not, if he allowed those whom he called his peculiar people to eat such loathsome food as was then common, or even such as so civilized a people as the Chinese now esteem delicacies, rats, birds' nests, dogs, and lizards, whilst others eat infinitely worse. Appetite is a matter primarily of inherent tendency, and though, to be sure, it may be trained by custom and restrained by such directions as these before us, yet the great principle that develops itself in the passage before us is this: the difference in the natures of beings, where there is any being with an unclean nature, it forever remains so unless it have a new nature. In the Hindu fable, the dove flies down to the marsh and seeks to enchant the crane, which is eating snails, by recounting the beauties of paradise. At length, the crane draws its beak out of the mud and inquires whether there are any snails there. The dove is afraid there are not. At least has never noticed them. Whereat the crane buries again its beak in the mud with an air that implies that the conversation is irrelevant and intrusive. Heaven itself were hell to the crane without snails. As to Israel, almost the whole natural realm, the earth, the air, the sea, was at their disposal for food, but there were certain restrictions. The forbidden things were in general things unwholesome or unsafe for that climate, that is natural and very obvious. But all these things were given to them for ensamples and are typical in many ways. For instance, taking them as types of natures or characters, to be clean an animal required the foot divided, that is, the principle of separation in the walk or general conduct, for there is evil in the earth, the foot must not sink into it. But this feature by itself a swine may have, and this principle without the chewing of the cud only produces the ascetic or Pharisee, a hard, rigid, uncomfortable, God-forsaken, religiousness, whose highest reach of piety consists in, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men. On the other hand, the camel, or hare, which chews the cud but does not divide the hoof, is equally to be rejected, though perhaps it is not entirely so objectionable. This indicates a nature that eats spiritual food, that which is unseen is spiritual, and food that has been dead but is now alive again in resurrection, i.e., grass or grain, whereas the carnivora only feed on what is dead, but at the same time a nature which has no principle of stability and separation in its walk. Such natures as these can charm with their apprehension of the highest spiritual themes while their lives are low and unworthy. Balaam was such an one. How lofty the flight of his spiritual emotions, how base his cunning and avaricious life. The pathos of Lawrence Sterne over the caged bird and the dead donkey has drawn tears from thousands who perhaps would have been touched only with contempt did they know of the cruelty with which the writer neglected his own wife and home, yet his sermon on conscience is one of the finest things I ever read. In Bunyan, Christian and faithful are met by a tall man more comely at a distance than at hand. This man is extremely fluent on spiritual matters and quite charms faithful with his fine discourse. Christian, however, is not so much enamored. He says that the man's name is talkative, and that notwithstanding his fine tongue he is but a sorry fellow. Faithful replies, well, he seems to be a very pretty man, whereon Christian says, that is to them that have not a thorough acquaintance with him, for he is best abroad, near home, he is ugly enough all he hath lieth in his tongue. Faithful then says this reminds him of Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. The hare cheweth the cud, but yet is unclean because he partake not the hoof. And this truly resembleth talkative, he cheweth the cud, he seeketh knowledge, he cheweth upon the word, but he divideth not the hoof. He partake not with the way of sinners. You have spoken, says Christian, for aught I know, the true gospel sense of those texts. And for aught I know, too. Israel's diet, continued. In regard to the quadruped selected and rejected, then we can see a fair evidence of a spiritual application, but that may not be quite so obvious in regard to the fish and birds. A fish to be accepted must have both scales and fins. The scales were considered by Agassiz to be of sufficient importance to form a basis on which to distinguish the different species, and this basis has been generally accepted. They form a bright, strong, flexible, defensive armor, and may remind one of Ephesians 6 verse 11. With this armor, the fish are more hardy and less liable to be injured and influenced by passing external impressions. The fins are serviceable for balancing, guiding, and staying. Of course, all fish swim through the water by means of the tail, therefore fins can, in a way, be done without, as far as mere progress goes. In addition to this, the fins are rudiments of higher powers. We see this in the development of the pectoral fins into a kind of limb in the climbing perch, and into a kind of wing in the flying gurnard and exo volitans. Fins consequently suggest a nature which has poise and self-control and has also in itself the impulses and rudiments of faculties which belong to a higher existence, a life in a celestial sphere. We need not believe in the evolutionary dogma, that one animal changes into another just because it has rudiments of faculties which that other possesses, any more than that a kettle will ultimately become a teapot because it has a spout. Still there is a relationship between the wing and the fin which is traced back even to the saurians of the Paleozoic times, and there is an embryo wing implanted even in the most unlikely places, as in caterpillars. The human caterpillar, feeling his proneness, sighs, "Oh that I had wings like a dove." Some day perhaps, when he has passed through the chrysalis stage, they will come. The birds of prey are excluded, the vulture and the kite after his kind, every raven after his kind. These feed not only on death like the carnivora but on corruption. This is the nature that finds delight in the contemplation and appropriation of what is not only dead but foul and putrid. But is there any such nature? Unfortunately, we know too well that there is, and when we stand outside the cage of a bird like the African sociable vulture, and see it plunge its reeking beak in some loathsome carrion, we are apt to wonder what enjoyment it finds in that. But this is typical. There are European sociable vultures as well who feed on garbage, it may be. All of this description are unclean, whether they are characterized by power and dignity like the eagle, cruelty like the hawk, impudence like the cuckoo, or the ponderous and shallow gravity, the stupid wisdom, of the owl. "I don't believe," said Fox, "any living man is half so wise as Lord T. looks. Amongst them all there is none so impressive looking as the owl, to those that do not know that his omniscience is only parochial, that his attitude of grave impartial rebuke is only the fear to commit himself, that his preference for the twilight is not because he loves meditation, for he is only dozing when he looks so thoughtful, nor because of his exceptional devoutness, but simply because he is always confused by the daylight. His demeanor of calm disparagement does not mean a bit that he is superior in sanctity to everyone else, it only means that he thinks himself so. It is the general censoriousness which characterizes this predacious nature. We can forgive him much on account of his purblindness, but surely it is going too far when, like the mantis religiosa, he spells prey with an E, instead of with an A. A habit of inherent fault-finding is one of the most commonly known features of this nature and one of the most rapidly developed. But it finds faults not so much from a desire to correct them as that, from a natural aptitude, it looks for them in every direction, except inwardly. It loves to pick up morsels of evil from all sides, and whilst shaking its head over them and appearing to condemn them, quietly puts them in the mouth, masticates and ruminates them. Finally, whatsoever things are untrue, whatsoever things are dishonest, unjust, impure, unlovely, and of bad report, if there be any vice, if there be any blame, the carrion-feeding nature thinks on these things. The elements of all these evil tendencies are of course in each of us. But if we have also been granted new natures, we have the power to reckon dead and make no provision for the flesh. Was not old Ulysses right, to speak as a man, when he smote down the scurrilous theorists with rough blows, and Achilles when he slew him? But oh, for the wings of the dove covered with silver and her feathers with yellow gold. Though we have lean among the pots, yet may we be so. Not as a raven but a dove, the Holy Ghost came from above, that wisdom which is from above, first pure, then peaceable, gentle and easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. It is simple concerning evil, wise concerning that which is good. Far from the carrion-feeding natures, it rejoices not in iniquity, but in the truth, imputes no evil but hopes all things and believes all things. Nay, even when the evil is unquestionably there, it is slow to see it, as to which we read even of the most blessed, that if he should mark iniquities who shall stand, that he had not seen iniquity in Jacob nor perverseness in Israel, though there was little else there. The Lord, I think, would be well pleased to see more of the same nature in us all, that we might have doves' eyes and not vultures. Thus the bridegroom says, behold thou art fair, my love, behold thou art fair, thou hast dove's eyes within thy locks. In general too, all creeping things, all crawling, prone, and groveling natures, are rejected. But if they had legs above their feet to leap withal upon the earth like the locusts, they were accepted. For these had an inherent power that could overleap those earthly obstacles that the absolutely prone nature is stopped by. If you cannot plow through the log, Abraham Lincoln used to say, plow around it. It is better still when there is that inward faculty, which he himself possessed so largely, that enables us to rise over it.